Hi, and thank you for attending the 2025 First Wisconsin Advocacy Conference. I'm so excited by how many teams we have attending the conference this year. We had a very successful previous conference, obtaining a $250,000 increase in funding for Wisconsin robotics teams every year. I hope this presentation helps to prepare you for another great advocacy conference. This presentation provides an introduction to advocacy and will prepare you to be an effective advocate, even if you are a complete beginner. Hi, my name is Megan Volkening. I'm a member of the First Wisconsin Board of Directors, and I'm a first alumni who participated in FLL, FTC, and FRC. I was a 2021 Dean's List winner and the Woody Flowers Grant recipient of that year. I helped start the Wisconsin First Advocacy Committee back about 5 years ago now, and I've attended the National Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C., both virtually and in person for the last 5 years. Now I'm also working for a nonprofit called the Student Association for STEM Advocacy. So I help plan not only this state advocacy conference, but also multiple other conferences across the country. And I'm now attending UW-Madison studying mechanical engineering.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Hughes. I did FLL, FTC, and FRC for a total of 6 years. I was a Dean's List semifinalist in 2022, and I was a three-time NAC participant, and I also worked for SASA for several years. And I am also a mechanical engineer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So a little about the history of SASA, which is the Student Association for STEM Advocacy, as Megan just mentioned. In 2009, a Michigan FRC team took a trip to DC to do some advocacy. And in 2014, after doing several trips to the DC area, they decided to start the first National Advocacy Conference hosted in DC by them and a couple other teams that had done advocacy in the area. And in 2019, after hosting the first the conference for several years, they decided to found SASA, the Student Association for STEM Advocacy, as a nonprofit to run the National Advocacy Conference every year. And since then, SASA has been running state conferences as well as the National Advocacy Conference across the U.S.
SASA's mission is to develop student advocates to expand access to STEM opportunities. Each year, we host a national advocacy conference in Washington, D.C., which helps bring together almost 300 students to advocate at the nation's capital. We also are helping to host other state advocacy conferences similar to the Wisconsin State Conference across the country. This past year, we ran 12 different state conferences, but this number is rapidly growing. We have many successful stories in both state and national advocacy. And if you're interested in getting more involved in advocacy beyond this, we have the website, Twitter, and Facebook for SASA. Definitely check them out. And if you're interested in attending the conference in Washington, D.C., it is a phenomenal experience. Here in Wisconsin, we've been working on advocacy for quite the years now. Our advocacy efforts here in Wisconsin really started back in 2019. We had 5 Wisconsin teams go and attend that national advocacy conference that I was talking about in Washington, D.C. At that conference, the 5 teams decided to start advocacy efforts and bring them back to Wisconsin. We hosted a virtual advocacy conference for the first time in February 2021. We had around 20 attendees on our virtual conference. This grew into our first in-person conference, which took place in 2023 with around 130 attendees. We hosted our second in-person conference last year with over 185 attendees, and we were able to get our first successful budget increase. We're looking to grow that even further this year, and I'm really excited to see where this goes.
So just a little bit more about the success of the Wisconsin Advocacy Conference so far. So that increase that Megan referred to was when we increased the Wisconsin DPI Robotics League Participation Grant from $500,000 to $750,000 a year for first teams in Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin Advocacy Committee now consists of Wisconsin first teams and members of the Student Board of Directors. And as she also said, we had over 180 participants in last year's advocacy conference, and we were really excited and very hopeful that we can increase that number and make it even bigger and better this year. So a lot of you guys might have signed up for this conference, do advocacy, do something cool, but why is advocacy really, really important? So in a democracy, which is obviously what the US is, it's really important that everybody inputs their opinions on what they really, really believe in into the government. And that's what we are here doing today. As you guys listen to this to prepare for the Advocacy Day, is we are getting ready to talk to legislators and representatives about something that we really believe in. We all really like FIRST. We all know that FIRST is something that should be expanded on more in the US, and that's what we're here to share today. And it's really important for citizens to have their voices heard in that way. And advocating isn't just for you or your others right around you or your team, it's for your community. So a lot of the teams in Wisconsin that are in the super far north that aren't able to drive all the way down to Madison and advocate to in person, we're here advocating for them today. We're advocating for everybody who isn't able to get to Madison and advocate directly to legislators to increase funding for FIRST so that they can still continue and have success as a FIRST team, even though they're not able to get all the way here physically.
And many of you watching this video may be new to advocacy. But even though you think you aren't an advocate, I can guarantee you that you have advocated before in the past for something, but it might not have been, state legislation. For example, you could have advocated to your parents for a pet. I know I wanted a dog for many years, and I would constantly tell my parents we should get a dog. But not only would I tell them that we should get a dog, I'd try to give them reasons for why we should give them a dog. I should be like, we should get a dog because of this, this, and this. And that is an example where I advocated for something that I wanted. Maybe when you were a younger kid, you advocated to your parents to have a later bedtime. They wanted you to be in bed a certain time. You wanted to be in a bed at a different time. So you tried to convince them why they should let you go to bed later. You could also have negotiated grades with a teacher or a professor. I know sometimes you might have been, a tenth of a percent off that A that you really wanted. So you may have emailed or talked to your professor and gave them reasons why they should have raised your grade up. Maybe you attended all the classes and you really participated in class, and so you put your best foot forward and you are so close to that A, you just are really asking them if they would be able to make that possible. And that is another example where you might have already been an advocate. So although this may seem intimidating, if you don't have experience advocating at a state or national level, you have some experience, and make sure to draw on that when we're applying it to state advocacy. There are so many different things that you can advocate for. Like the slide says, you can really advocate for anyone or anything. There's so many different people you can advocate to, on behalf of, and so many different topics you can advocate for. Just focusing in on robotics, there's still a large variety of different things we could be advocating for. One is a graduation requirements should contain a CTE or career and technical experience before people graduate. This is some kind of hands-on technical training. You could also advocate that every student should be exposed to STEM before graduation. And even within that, there's a wide variety of specifics that you could go into and how you want that to be obtained or what the requirements for that should be. You could also advocate that FIRST should have the same benefits as varsity sports. This is something that has actually been successfully advocated for in different states. I think Minnesota is one. So by advocating for this, they were able to get certain benefits such as minimum coaching pay, access to the school facilities, time off for tournament travels, and other such things that sports teams get in the school. You could also advocate for a national FIRST day or a state FIRST day to raise awareness for the program. And lastly, a very common thing you can advocate for at the state level and national level is funding for FIRST programs. And that is our main focus here in Wisconsin. But there's lots of other things that you could be advocating for if we chose that.
So now we're going to go into a little bit more about how and where you can start advocating.
So the very first step for advocacy is to pick a target. Like I said, there's so many different people we could advocate to or things we could advocate for. So it's important to narrow down what you're trying to do. It's really important to have a goal in mind and to figure out who's the best person to help you reach that goal. It's really important that you advocate to the right person. I like to emphasize this, but it's really, really important that you understand this. A good example is trying to increase state funding for robotics. That's our goal here. And we go to our state representatives and senators in order to do this. But if you were to say to go to a teacher, someone who's prominent at your school, and make that same ask, I could go to my teacher and say, hey, I really enjoy robotics, and I really believe that we should have more state funding. That teacher probably agrees with you, and they could say, yeah, me too. But they don't actually have the power to make a difference. They don't have the power to change state funding. Only our assemblymen and our senators have that power. So it's important to know who to go to. In contrast, maybe I want to get a team started at my school. It wouldn't really be appropriate for you to go to your state legislator because they are way beyond that. It would be more appropriate in that situation to talk to a teacher, a principal, or maybe a superintendent or a school board, but someone more at the local school level. So it's really important to know what we're advocating for and who's the appropriate person to advocate to.
And once you've identified really who that exact person you want to advocate to, we are going to start forming that relationship. So that is what Advocacy Day is all about. It's going in and having those meetings with the legislator or representative that you have your meeting with and starting to form that relationship. So as soon as you walk in that door and you make your introductions, you have a first impression. That's just the very beginning of the relationship you have with that legislator or representative. And from there on, throughout the entire rest of your meeting, the positive feelings you bring towards first and how much you love the program really just continues to build on that relationship and continues to speak to them on how important the program is and how much you believe in it. And that relationship doesn't just happen from that meeting. It happens from the email before when you're asking for that meeting with their staffers. It happens afterwards when you send your follow-up. And afterwards is where we kind of get into that settle in phase as well. After you have a couple meetings, maybe meeting with your representative for 2 or 3 advocacy days and emailing them throughout the year occasionally, that's when you kind of really get into that settle in phase. So that's really your long-term relationship with that legislator representative. So that is updating them on how your team is doing or how the first program is doing a couple times a year. You don't want to email them too much because they're super busy. They get a ton of emails. Just occasionally is great. And also inviting them to stuff like tournaments, stuff like practices, just that those updates and just keeping them up to date with how you're doing, how First is doing, and why it continues to be important within the area that they are in charge of.
This slide really gets into the process of making that first connection that Ian was talking about, and it's the beginning steps of forming a relationship with your legislator. So first, a recommendation is to start local. This could mean your school, or it could mean the state level. Most of our education funding actually comes from the state and the local level, not the federal level. So while you may want to go to DC and advocate, and that is also an amazing step in advocating for robotics, the local work we do is extremely important for education funding. The first step is once you identify your target, you want to write to them. This could likely be an email. So first, send an email to either the legislator or whoever else you're advocating to, or their staffer if they're at a state or federal level. Write down an email, tell them who you are, tell them about the first program and why you want to meet with them, and ask them to set up a meeting with you. From there, you can follow up in about a week if they don't respond, and then if they don't respond again, you can call them, which is the second step of a phone call. And then last, from either your email or a phone call, you really want the last step to be a visit. This could either be a meeting with them in their office, or you could invite them out to a tournament or your build space to see the first robotics program in person. But really, at the end of all this, we want them to meet with you in the office, and hopefully also come out and see some robots in action. One example of this is at our school. We needed funding when we started our FRC team. We had a couple months of the season and we were really looking for some funding. So although our school originally said they weren't going to provide us with support, we found a grant that the school was receiving called ESSER funds, which was a COVID relief grant that could be spent on starting new clubs up in the school. So we decided to write to our school board. We wrote them an email explaining to them who we were, introducing the new program we were getting started at the school, and telling them what ESSER funds were, and asking us if we could come to one of their school board meetings and talk to them further. From there, we were able to visit them at to school board meetings, talk to them about FIRST Robotics, about the grant program that we wanted them to support us through. And because of that advocacy at the local level, our team was able to receive $15,000, which is a huge help to us getting our FRC team started. So that's just one example of how local advocacy, even just at your school, can be super impactful. But no matter where you're advocating, whether it's the school level, in your town, your state, or the national level, the steps of write, call, and visit are going to remain the same.
I talked about it a little bit earlier on the previous slide, but excuse me, I just wanted to highlight it again. Advocacy is all about relationships, relationships, relationships. Building that relationship with the representative you're talking to really is what we're all about here on Advocacy Day and with doing advocacy in Wisconsin. We're not going to be able to advance any more funding or change any of the bills we want to change unless we have a positive relationship built with a lot of different legislators. And that's why we're all so happy to see so many of you guys here today.
Another piece of advice we want to give you comes from the quote, "Do what you can where you are with what you have," which is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. Advocacy doesn't always go as planned. You're going to need to be flexible and adapt to changes both from yourself or maybe driven by the legislator. For example, a lot of times their office might be full, so you may find yourself meeting in an odd meeting location. It could be a hallway or a really small room that you weren't expecting, and that's something that you have to be flexible for. If they ask you, "Oh, are you okay meeting in here?" Say yes and make it work the best that you can. You may also run into meetings with staffers. It is very common at both the state and national level to meet with a staffer instead of the actual legislator. The staffer is someone who really is in charge of driving the legislator's policy. They listen to different groups and do a lot of research into which policies they believe the legislator is likely to support, and they help advise the legislator on what to vote for. Because at the end of the day, there's hundreds of different policy areas that a legislator is responsible for being knowledgeable about and voting on. And they can't possibly do all the research themselves. So these staffers are really important in telling the legislator what to focus on and what to vote for. So if you have a meeting with a staffer, treat it exactly the same as you were to treat a legislator. Treat them with respect and also importance because they're going to go back and tell the legislator all about the meeting. So make sure you treat it just the same. And then also just try to be flexible. They may ask to change the time, and if at all possible, try to make that adjustment for them. Or if they have to shorten the meeting, be understanding and try to adjust, the length of what you're talking about a little bit to fit it in. But really, no matter what comes up, just try to be flexible and go with the flow as much as you can while advocating.
To affect the process, you have to know the process. It really is important for you to come to your meetings prepared because if you come unprepared, it's not going to really go that well, and they're going to understand that you don't really know a lot about what you're talking about. So to be familiar with the process, you don't need to know everything, but you got to be prepared for your meetings. One of the main highlights we like to say during these slideshows is that if you don't know something, it is completely okay to say, "I don't have this bit of information right now," or "I'm not exactly sure. I'll email you after the meeting." And in your follow-up email after the meeting, you can include that bit of information that you weren't able to provide during the meeting. So whether it's a statistic or anything like that, it's okay to include it afterwards. Some key things to know about the Wisconsin government when you're going into your meetings for Advocacy Day are the key committees. So what committees are your representatives, the people that you're meeting with on? Are they in charge of any of the committees that would vote on the Wisconsin DPI grant or not? And it's completely okay if they're not, they're still super important to advocate to. Also, the timelines of the budget. Sometimes when we're advocating in Wisconsin, we have a biannual budget, so we don't pass a new budget every single year, which means we might be doing advocacy during a year that isn't an actual budget year where they would pass it. But once again, still super important to do advocacy during those years. The applicable bills, we're going to be focusing on the Wisconsin DPI Robotics League Participation Grant. Not really anything else. That's the focus for this conference, and also how bills are amended. So just kind of how the government works in general is also a good bit of information to have. Some of the local government leads that you might be talking to as far as a school district goes. So as Megan mentioned before, this is for starting teams, doing stuff within your school and your local community, are like teacher, principal, superintendent, also Department of Directors, elected township board, and county executive, county clerk, and those sorts of people if you're doing something on a local level, whether it be an outreach event or starting up new teams, that sort of stuff. Then you move up to state and national government. So obviously with the state government, which is where we are, some of the big players in the state government are the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, and a couple of others. And as far as the national government goes, you have the president, vice president, all the cabinet level positions, and the House of Representatives as long as the Senate.
So in our advocating, we're really going to be focusing on the assemblymen and senators at the Wisconsin level, and then our representatives and senators at the national level. So our legislators in the list that Ian was talking about. And like you said, there's different committees that are more important to what we're doing. And these are a few of the ones that are important to helping us pass our bill. So in the assembly, we have the Ways and Means Committee, which helps deal with which legislation is going to move forward and the process for doing different procedures in the government, the Education Committee, the Finance Committee, which helps make budgetary decisions, Science, Technology, and Broadband, colleges and universities, and the Workforce Development and Economic Opportunities. The Senate has less committees since there are less members, but some key committees in the Senate would be Education, Finance, and Economic Development and Technical Colleges. There's also a Joint Committee on Finance, which is members of both the Assembly and the Senate. They work together to pass the finalized budget with amendments from both the Assembly and the Senate. So on this slide is also a website. This is just the Wisconsin state government website. You can go up, you can look up your representative or senator and figure out what committees they are on from that website. And we want to do some research on our legislator before our meeting. It's important to know as much as you can about them because, like Ian says, the more we know, the more we can affect the process. Knowing a lot about your legislator can help make connections with them and help them be more interested in what you're saying. For example, you could find some personal connections. Do they have kids that attend your school or have attended your school? If they have any important committees they're on, they may have another job or have had a different previous job other than working in politics. So maybe they were a teacher or an engineer, and that's something you could connect with them on. It's also important to know legislation that they've historically supported or voted against, or maybe some that they've really supported by helping be an author of a bill. The more we know about the ways they tend to vote, the more we can tailor our conversation to them. Robotics is, a wide topic that can appeal to both parties in the government, but you may want to adjust exactly what you're telling them. For example, for Republicans, they do tend to focus more on workforce development and economics. So they're likely to support robotics because you are developing future workforce and you're developing those technical and trade skills that they are really interested in seeing. Whereas on the Democrat side, they may be more interested in it from an education perspective and advancing education in the state. So both parties support robotics, but you may want to be careful a little bit about focusing on the things that they're more likely to support, which is why we do our research. And since you're watching this ahead of time, you probably have a little more time to do research, but I wanted to show you that it doesn't have to be a huge process. This is one of my this is my state senator here in Madison, and I really didn't know much about her since I just moved to a new district this year. So I wanted to do a little research on her. I went to her website, and this is what I see. And then the next slide shows what I was able to learn from the website. Just from spending 5 minutes on the website, I found out a good amount of information about her. She's a Democrat, which helps me know she's likely interested in education and things like that. But specifically, I found listed in her list of top priorities, public education and economic justice. From this, I know I can focus on the education aspects and also maybe hit on how robotics helps, underprivileged students and underrepresented students find a path in STEM since she's interested in economic justice. She was also a former nonprofit executive, and she's on the Joint Committee on Finance and also the Senate Committee on Universities and Revenue. She lives in Madison and also has school-aged children. So these are just a few things that I learned about her, and I can try to help connect with her. And I also know that she's on two very relevant committees, so that's really important to know going into my meeting with her.
So now to talk a little bit more about the DPI grant itself. It is a grant that provides $750,000 to robotics teams in the state of Wisconsin, and that is up from $500,000 a couple years ago. Yay. And teams must have members in grades 6 through 12 and have matching funds to get the grant once they've applied for it. And each team can apply for up to $6,000 per year and are reimbursed for expenses at the end of the year. And one other thing about meetings, I talked a little bit about a follow-up email after a meeting, but another really important thing to have during your meetings is a leave behind. So it's just a really short one-page summary. This is an exact one that I've used in some of my meetings before. Just a leave behind, basically just have some information about your team, maybe a picture of you to competition, info about the first program in general. So you can kind of see on that middle left side, there's just some general information about first. Also our ask, um, as well as the social media and contact info for your team, because usually you'll ask them if they want to stop by like a practice or a competition or something like that. So just some way to contact you is very important to have on that as well. And it really just helps them kind of remember exactly what you talked about in a summarized form. So it is super important to have one. Um, and yeah.
This presentation was really an overview of a lot of different things about advocacy. We talked about who you should advocate to, what you can advocate for, a little bit about the key players and what to know, and the research and preparation you should do before your meetings. Some key takeaways from this presentation, like Ian kept saying, is advocacy is all about building relationships. Relationships, relationships, relationships. Yes, we're pushing for more funding, but at the end of the day, if we don't have the relationship to back our ask, they're likely going to say no. The more excited they are to see us, the better chance we have of getting them to push our legislation. You can also advocate for anyone or anything. These skills that you're learning can be used to advocate for so many different things, and it's a really good skill to have. Also, make sure to do your homework before Advocacy Day. We will have a separate presentation focusing on exactly what you need to do for your homework, going back over some of the things we talked about in this presentation. So make sure you give that presentation a watch. It should be a lot shorter, but it will focus on everything you need to do before your presentation. Also, invite your legislator to an event or your build space. After your meeting is over, make sure to give them an invite to your next competition, or maybe to come and check out your robot at your lab. That will help build this relationship. And then if you really enjoy our advocacy, there's lots of opportunities to get more involved in First Wisconsin, or not First Wisconsin, sorry, First Advocacy and robotics advocacy across the country. The Student Associations for STEM Advocacy was mentioned briefly at the beginning, but it's a nonprofit that works with both FIRST and VEX teams across the country to advocate for robotics. You can buy a membership for the nonprofit. It's just $25 a year for an individual or $200 for a team. And you get at least 3 interesting emails teaching you advocacy terms, keeping you up to date on past legislation that was important in the previous month, and keeping you aware about legislation that's up and coming in the next couple of months. You'll also receive a discount on the National Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C., and you'll also receive action alerts whenever something important is happening at the federal level that you should go and talk to your legislator about or be aware about. You'll get an alert in an email. So if you're interested, check us out more on the website, Twitter, or Facebook. And then this is just a little information about the National Advocacy Conference. We usually have at least a couple teams from Wisconsin go each year. I think the most we ever had was the 5 the year that we started the conference, but we always have at least a few teams. It is at the end of June, June 22nd to 24th in Washington, D.C. You are staying in a hotel with like 300 plus other FIRST and VEX teams from across the country. You get a day and a half of advocacy training. It is basically this, but even better, because not only are you getting the boring presentations, but you also are hearing from phenomenal guest speakers. I've heard from cabinet members, the first CEO, and a bunch of other really fantastic speakers. You learn more about advocacy, the federal government, and education funding, and then you get to go out on Capitol Hill and advocate to your congressman for a day. I've gotten to take the underground train between the House and the Senate, been in the White House, and it is just a phenomenal experience. So if you're interested in more advocacy or also networking with other robotics teams, I highly recommend the conference. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to talk to you more about the opportunities with SASA. Yeah, and with that, if you have any questions, our contact information is on the next slide. Feel free to reach out to us before the conference or reach out to Emma if you have any questions, and we should be able to help you get started. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Wisconsin Advocacy Conference. I know it will be a huge success. Thank you so much for watching.